Welcome back to Between Two Racks with the Kilo Crew. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to call this one a rapid fire episode. So I've gathered a bunch of questions from our viewers and we're just going to kind of run through them. Everyone's going to have some answers. We'll kind of just see where it takes us. So let's kick it. First question, I'm sure a lot of people will enjoy to hear our opinion on this, is training to failure. What constitutes failure? How frequent in the microcycle? And what systems you should use with it most? So, Steph, I'm going to turn this one over to you first.
So let's talk about what training to failure is or what it means. So, a common term for training to failure is training to maximal voluntary contraction. So is your own nervous system's ability to create maximum output. So the truest expression of maximal voluntary contraction would be a 1 RM. So you lift 1 rep, you can lift the second rep. So this would be maximal voluntary contraction, which means you're training to failure. It could also be any other RM, like a 6 RM, where you're doing 6 reps, but 7 rep is impossible. This would be training to maximal voluntary contraction. Now, the thing about training to failure, I know that Stephen J. Fleck in 1983 came out with a big study where he proposed that the only way that you could recruit maximal motor unit activation was by training to maximal voluntary contraction, so training to concentric failure. So if you accept the fact that in order to fully develop strength, you need to create a maximum amount of motor unit activation, then it makes sense that training to failure is a prerequisite for optimization of strength development. Now, a little later, even Vladimir Zatsiorsky in his book, Science and Practice of Strength Training, talks about the importance of maximal voluntary contraction and how you need to train to failure in certain situations in order to reach maximal motor unit activation. And other guys like Inoka and Jacques Duchateau and people like this did a bunch of research confirming the need for maximal motor unit activation in order to develop strength. Now, let's go back to Vladimir Zatsiorsky. So in his book, he talks about 3 different methods to create maximal motor unit activation. And the 3 methods are max effort, dynamic effort, and repeated effort. So these terms are quite reminiscent of Westside, simply because Louis Simmons used a lot of Vladimir Zatsiorsky's concept to create a system. So max effort, what happens is typically the load is really, really heavy. I know in the case of Louis Simmons, he's talking about loads over 90% of 1 RM. The scientific literature tend to agree that the minimum threshold would be 80%. So it's still like a fairly wide window, but it's still pretty high load. What happens when you're training at high loads, especially at 90 plus, you are predominantly recruiting fast twitch fibers because the force's demands are such that you have no choice but to recruit fast twitch fiber in order to move the weight. But because fast twitch fibers have poor endurance properties, as soon as you recruit them and use them, they tend to fatigue, and a motor unit is only trained or once it's fatigued. Okay, so just activating it per se doesn't mean anything. You need to activate it and fatigue it in order to get this training response. So whenever you're doing max effort at high loads, you are in a way creating maximum motor unit activation because of the predominant fiber recruited during that exercise. Now, the dynamic effort method, the range and load might be super wide. We're talking about anywhere from 30, 40%, depending on the source, all the way up to 70, 80%. And now it's more a question of how fast can you move that load. And the velocity now, instead of the load per se, becomes the driver of motor unit activation. So the faster you're able to move a weight, the higher the amount of motor units you need to activate and recruit in order to move that weight at fast speeds. And the faster you go, the more type 2X fibers you need to recruit in order to move that weight. And we know that the type 2X are the biggest, strongest muscle fibers in the human body. So these are going to fatigue real quick and get activated and fatigue and train very easily. Now, the nuanced part is the repeated effort method, because the repeated effort method, we're talking about loads anywhere from like 60% of 1 RM to about like 80% of 1 RM, but now at normal velocities. Like if you're using the tempo method, like we're talking about like a 3010 tempo, for example, where a concentric is, fast, but not necessarily like voluntarily accelerated. Okay, so now the only way at this point that you can create maximal motor unit activation is by training to failure. Because what happens is if you're doing a set of 10, for example, the weight is fairly light. Like it would be about 74% of 1 RM. So the first few reps of that set are pretty easy. So at that point, there's no need for high threshold motor unit to be recruited, because you can do the work with slow twitch fibers. And the slow twitch fibers have long endurance properties, so they are activated, but they are not necessarily fatigued, so they are not trained. Now, as you keep going through the set and you get closer to your 10 rep target, and it's becoming harder and harder and harder, now what happens is you are slowly activating more and more and more and more motor units to allow you to keep pushing that weight that becomes incrementally harder to move concentrically. So by that point, now you are activating higher threshold motor units to finish that set. Like the last few reps, you're activating fast twitch fibers. So now you're activating them and fatiguing them, hence you're training them. But where, in my opinion, where training to failure becomes more important would be with that repeated effort method, because now, let's say that you have a set of 10, like a true 10 RM, where you couldn't perform 11 reps. And on rep 7 and 8, it starts to get quite challenging, but you could have done 10. But because it's hard, you're stopping after 8 reps. Now, technically speaking, you left 2 reps in the tank where you could have used these 2 extra reps to actually push through to get true maximal motor unit activation. Because at the end of the day, like Flex said in his research, and Inoda and all these guys, is that in order to maximize strength response, you need to create maximal motor unit activation. So if you're constantly training short of failure in these situations, you are missing out on potential. So if we're taking these concepts and we're transposing this to a typical kilo strength session, where we have the A series, which is a compound multi-joint movement, so our primate. Now, because we tend to favor undulating periodization in the context of long-term development using undulating phase undulating periodization, the average rep you'll be performing over time is about 6, which is 83% of 1 RM. So by default, it kind of puts you in that max effort realm. So that first exercise, that primary movement, because it's a complex multi-joint movement, you want to emphasize quality work. You want to mitigate fatigue as much as you can, because the entire periodization model stems from that A series exercise. So if you're pushing yourself to failure on each and every set of your A series, so let's say you have 6 by 5, and you're taking each set to failure, you will be wiped, and your ability to replicate your second upper or lower body session within the week will be greatly impeded. But also at the same time, because the intensity associated with that A series is one that fits more the maximal effort method, you don't necessarily need to train to all-out failure to get a strength response. because at that point, you are building some level of intermuscular coordination through quality work, and you are building some intramuscular coordination. So we know that intramuscular coordination is mostly targeted at high loads, like even more so at 90 plus, but it still is an important factor at 80 plus. And intramuscular coordination, the more you build it, the more you train it, the greater your ability to recruit more and more and more motor units. So you need to look at your A series exercise more as a training rehearsal tool in order to build a better nervous system or a better machinery to create more force potential in the future. Now, as we're moving to the B series now, we're targeting assistance work. So smaller exercises, they can still be multi-joint, but the complexity is not as high. Now, the intensity drops because you already did your intensity work in the beginning when the central nervous system was fresh. You've done that. All that quality work is done. The assistance work is to help enhance your potential on the primary lift. So by that point, all you need is 2 or 3 sets, maybe 4 if you're a machine and have great work capacity. On these assistance work, any intensity window that's appropriate for the repeated effort method, we're talking about in most cases like 6 to 10 or 6 to 12 reps. So in order to maximize that B series, you would want to train to failure in order to create that maximal motor unit activation on that movement pattern. But it's okay and it's manageable because we're doing 2 or 3 sets of it. Okay, so it's not like the entire strength training session we're hammering you with sets done to failure. It actually would be quite counterproductive to do this. Now, the C series remedial work, now we're going down the funnel even more. Now we're talking about, in most cases, a single joint exercise. So the amount of fatigue created by this movement is very minimal anyways. And now the remedial exercise, by default, we're targeting weak points in a muscular chain or a weak point in terms of prehab, rehab. So at that point, depending on what the exercise is, depending on the ability of the trainee to do that movement, you might either do some max effort, so you're leaving a few reps in the tank using reps in reserve to reinforce high quality work. So now the damage in terms of the recovery curve is very, very, very low. Or if, let's say, you're doing something as simple as a lateral raise or incline curl or tricep extension, like very purely single joint, simple movement, now you could do 10 or 12 or 15 reps to failure for 2 or 3 sets. And again, it's not that big of a deal. It's a single joint movement, but at least you're maximizing the motor unit activation potential of these movements. Now, there's nuances that are very important. Yep. And we always say, I know like you made a post like 10 days or 2 weeks ago on the Kilo page where it said context, and context is everything. I think that's lost. A lot of people miss context because the entire industry now, it's snippets of information. So although Fleck, McDougall, Inoka, Zatsiorsky talked about the importance of reaching maximal voluntary contraction to maximize strength, it works in very specific contexts. And the way we create a microcycle where we have a upper body 1, lower body 1, upper body 2, lower body 2. So now it means that we have 4 strength training sessions per week, but each workout has completely different exercises, which means that we have completely different motor unit pull that we're targeting each and every time. And fatigue is very specific to the motor unit pull that you stimulated with the specific exercise you're using. So if I'm doing overhead press on Monday, for example, and I'm doing flat bench on Thursday, yes, they are both pressing movements, but they both will tap in slightly different motor unit pull. So the fatigue you encountered with your overhead press on Monday won't be the exact same as the fatigue you have on your bench press on Thursday. Now, there is such a thing as overall systemic fatigue that you need to account for. But purely on a motor unit perspective, your bench press motor units are fairly recovered because your frequency of that specific movement, it's once every 7 days. So in that case, it's not that far-fetched, nor is it that hard to push yourself to failure on 2 or 3 sets in the B series, 2 or 3 sets in the C series, and then step load your A series with that compound movement to reach maybe 1 set, your final set to maximal voluntary contraction, but you might not even need to. You might still get to a point where you have 1 rep in reserve. And I want to add one thing, one little asterisk to the whole thing. I'm a huge fan of using percentages. I'm weird in the sense that I use RM loads to gauge my periodization in a way, but the reality is it all comes from the intensities. But it comes from the intensities as a reflection of training predicted 1RM. And this is very, 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 very important because, for example, let's say that you base your planning off of like a Tudor Bumpa's periodization system, which is great. But what he likes to do during the restitution week, the realization phase, he likes to test during that phase. So he's going to test 1RMs on a bunch of lifts. But the problem is when you're testing, you get a very accurate number, which is true. You're going to get an accurate number of your back squat, an accurate number of your bench press. Not to the extent that you would in competition, because now at that point you have arousal and the excitement. Like typically, I think the research shows that it's almost close to 10% higher.
Yeah, and then even more well-trained people can be more. Yeah, like if people are really efficient at competition, can be up 15.
Yeah, I feel like I've seen 14 point something percent. So it's significant. So I'm not even talking about competitive 1RMs. But even tested 1RM, because the reason why they're going to be higher is because you're doing this fresh. You're in your unloading mesocycle, so now you're more fresh by default, and now you're simply doing a series of warm-up leading to that 1 rep max. Now, if you're using that 1 rep max, and you're like, okay, now I'm going to train at 75% of my 1RM for a phase, well, you have to understand now that if you're like, okay, I'm using 75% of 1RM and I'm doing 4x10, well, you're going to have one hell of a drop-off, okay? Because now you're in training. Now you're doing multiple sets. Now you have multiple sessions within the week. So now you have cumulated fatigue. You might be week 2, week 3 of a hard meso. So you have cumulative fatigue. So that's why me as a coach in training, I use training predicted 1RM to gauge the load of the next mesocycle. So now we're comparing apples to apples. Okay, so to me, by default now, you're better able to manage your load. I mean, like you see it, like you barely ever miss reps simply because you're following each and every meso, the mathematical equation of a estimated 1RM, which has a built-in buffer anyways.
Yeah. But so, I used to be more of an ego lifter. So in my A series, I used to kind of go a little bit too high in what I was training.
Yeah, but that's because you were focusing more on the RM on the sheet instead of using the percentage. So that's why I'm saying I'm weird in that sense, because it looks like I'm a RM guy, but I'm actually a percentage guy. Yeah. Okay, but even then, I still step load that A series in order to mitigate and manage fatigue, so you can perform better. Now, going back to the whole training to failure, how can you plan it? So here's the thing, and while I was talking about context, okay? So the way we load our session works because of the way we write programs. But if you're like many people in the sports world, or now the new again trend of hypertrophy training, where you're doing 3 full body sessions per week, now you have to be careful. Because if, let's say you're squatting 3 times a week, and even if you equalize the number of sets, if you're training your squat to failure on each and every set of each and every session, you're looking for trouble. There will be a point of diminishing return unless you're using like the heavy duty Arthur Jones approach of 1 or 2 sets to failure and that's it, and then you move on. But if you're using multiple sets, which I think is needed in order to rehearse and get better at intermuscular coordination for the goals of being strong, okay? Let's not forget that there's more to strength training than just hypertrophy. You need multiple sets. That's how you learn, law of repeated effort. But if you train to failure 3 times a week on the same specific movement, you are looking for trouble. In fact, a lot of research in the last few years, I mean, like from 2016, even 2023, I've seen studies. But one that I like, it was done in 2021 by Kevin Carroll, like with the help of Mike Stone. And what's cool about that study is they used trained athletes. It was 15 trained athletes. So they all had at least 4 years of training age at a minimum of 3 times a week frequency. And they did a 10-week protocol where everything was equalized. Volume load, frequent, like everything was equalized. And they had one group doing every set to failure, the other group training at a relative intensity, so using percentages. So not one set did they do to failure, okay? That group, after 10 weeks, the relative intensity group that did not train to failure actually had gained more strength, had put on more size, had gained more muscle cross-section area, more muscle thickness, more type 2 fiber cross-section area than the group who trained to failure. And in the discussion part of the study, how the scientist explains it is simply because the RM group did not have the ability to recover properly, and there was a point of diminishing return. So this proves in a way that training to failure is not necessarily a necessity, but in that context. Yeah. Why wasn't it a necessity for this group? Because they were rehearsing the movement at least 3 sets, 3 times a week. Okay, so they had enough rehearsal. It's almost kind of like the concept of, for those of you who've done incomplete recovery functional hypertrophy training, whereas you're taking, let's say, 75% to 80% of your 1RM, and then you're doing multiple sets of 3 to 5, but with short rest periods. Of course, like the first few sets, you're training so far away from failure, but you're just rehearsing, creating work capacity, volume. But then eventually you do get a training response. You get a strength response and a training response. And this is because of the cumulative load across the training session. So you almost need to look at that microcycle at being beneficial because of the cumulative work done on that movement within the week, leading to these increases. Now, it would be interesting to see what happens past 10 weeks, okay? Because although there's a few studies recently that talks about the fact that you can build size and strength without training to failure, the problem is they all have that protocol. They are all full body 3 times a week. It would be interesting to see what would happen with more of a upper lower split, especially if they're changing motor unit, changing exercise every time. But anyway, so that's that. So my view on training to failure, it's important as long as you can recover from it, and then you need to adjust how you're dispatching it, depending on which programming model you're using and which periodization model you're using. But in the end, everything can work. It's just how you're applying it.
Yeah, there's a little more context I'd like to add. So for us, training to failure is breakdown form, so technical failure, on inability to maintain tempo. So again, back to technical failure. So it's not... Sorry?
I said those were my notes.
Yeah, so it's not true all-out muscular failure. And then we have a heavy reliance on free weights as a totality within our programming. So that means movement skill is going to, most of the time, affect where your failure point is. It's not that we're so heavily reliant on machines that we can go to true muscular failure as often. So if you're going to true muscular failure, then you could maybe reduce the amount of sets that you take to failure. So it's like there's just more context again. So once you're reliant on free weights and going to technical failure, that allows you to go to failure a little more often, because it's not just as demanding as taking a machine to true muscular failure.
And that's a very good point, because like of all the studies that I've read on this topic, outside of that Kevin Carroll one where they were actually using like squats and overhead press and stuff, most of them are like leg presses. But like those like lab leg presses where there's like a control of range of motion and all that kind of stuff, or leg extensions. So you definitely can push failure to a much greater extent with those than our definition of concentric failure, which is tempo, technique, so range of motion.
Range of motion, yeah.
So that to us is what we see training to failure at, like giving your best in the best context and the best form possible.
Yeah, and even like once you're using machines, now you've got cams that are going to match the strength curve. Whereas like for a lot of rays, our going to failure it's dictated by the movement, and the movement specifically is you're going to be at the point of greatest overload when you're in a shortened position, so you're in a weaker position. So that like straight away is going to be way less demand to take that to failure than a standard ladder race machine. So
and
it's just
and to I'm sorry,
no, you're good.
But to add to what Porrick is saying is also it's very important to understand that not all reps are created equal. No. So if you're doing 3 sets of 10 on leg extension, it is not the same training load on a recovery perspective as 3 sets of squats. So 3 sets of squat taking to all-out full-blown failure will be drastically more demanding than 3 sets of leg extension. 1, it's single joint versus multi-joint. 1 is fixed stable versus unstable, which requires stability. 2, 3, the leg extension is like basically a partial range of motion, like from 90 degree to full extension, depending on the design of the machine. If you're a great squatter, it's full knee flexion all the way up. Heck, there's even a huge difference in workload between a full squat and a half squat. We're talking about almost like a 50% difference. So like if you're really being very, very specific at calculating volume load or training loads over time, and you're doing a full squat, you need to add 50% more to the fatigue that it's creating, as opposed to doing the same 3 sets of 10 with a half squat. Okay, so there's so many factors involved that just counting the number of sets you're doing per week to failure, it's a very misleading.
Yeah, like sorry, go ahead.
I think it's also important to know who you're training. Like if someone's rehabbing or if you're training an older person, like the training to failure doesn't need to be like complete failure. And like you were saying, the tempo, the form is really important. Like you're not letting them cheat their reps or shorten their range of motion and stuff.
Yeah.
Yep. And then what about the forced reps? I mean, sometimes we use forced reps, and that's why we have to, again, you have to know who you're talking about, because we'll use that sometimes in training, but it's not something you want to do every time. So you'll see people who like spot them and then have them do an extra 3-4 reps all the time, then it just dips into their recovery curve too much.
Yeah, no, these techniques are really meant to be used sparingly for at very timely fashions, at very, like for maybe one set.
Yeah, definitely. Like if you're
C-series first.
Yeah, if you're going to do that for 3 sets, the guy better have great work capacity, because that's going to be rough.
Yeah, and then the work capacity too, right? So not everybody's equal. Like some people are a workhorse, they can take it, some they can't. So, but then, like to Alex's point, if you're training the older population, it's not like, because we're saying that training to maximal voluntary contraction is important in order to create maximal tension, to optimize training outcome and speed up the process as much as you can. But it doesn't mean that you need maximal tension all the time in order to progress, especially if you're untrained or if you're older and you have poor recovery capacity, you have a poor satellite cell pool. I mean, like all these things, you have to consider them.
Yeah, like a lot of people have built their career on their trainees doing sub-maximal work and just doing it for a long, long time, very consistently and getting strong. Like I'm forgetting the guy's name now. Russian kettlebell guy came up with strong first. I'm forgetting his
Pavel Tsasulin.
Yes, exactly. His whole grease the groove, like everything he does is sub-maximal, but he gets really good results because it's very consistently done in a very good manner. So
and it's still progressive.
So there's loads of ways of doing things. Just this is how we find works best in the style of training that we do things.
But even for hypertrophy, like there's a decent body of evidence now in the last at least 8 years that shows that the volume load is actually a bigger predictor of hypertrophy than simply load on the barbell. So, I mean, there is something to be said about just rehearsing at submaximal loads.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it goes back to, you started off the episode by truly explaining what training to failure is on a very scientific approach. And I just think sometimes people just hear training to failure and just immediately associate it to lifting heavy and not understanding what failure truly is. So I think you covered that very efficiently.
Yeah, I don't think it's rapid fire any longer.
That was a whole episode.
So Ben, I hope it answered your question.
Okay, moving on to another question. So how should a client adjust loading and exercise selection for kilo programming if the prescribed sets and reps are too demanding? So this question is very specific because they provided an example. So they said 5 sets of 7 reps of a chin-up is beyond what the client can perform. Should you implement the initial 3-phase chin-up approach?
I think with chin-ups, like no matter if your phase calls for 5 by 7, but the person can only get like 1 set at 7, then you would definitely start them lower in reps. So maybe you would have them do 4 reps and then try to get the 5 sets with 4 reps. And then the next session increase to 5 reps on the first set and then keep 4, 4, 4, 4. So every session you just increase the workload by 1 rep.
Total.
So, and then you just increase it that way. And then eventually they'll be able to get to 7. But to try to get it's just unrealistic. If they can't do it, they can't do it. So you just have to build from there. But I wouldn't go back to the chin-up progression because they can do the chin-up. They just need to build work capacity with the chin-up.
Yeah.
The only thing that's important to understand, though, is because what Alex described is the approach we use with everyone. But it's important to understand that on most lifts, and by experience, the chin-up, it's around 12 reps. There are minimum thresholds of repetitions per session in order to elicit the training response. So let's say that you can only perform 2. Well, you would need at least 6 sets of 2 in order to create a training response. So keep that in mind as you're working up, as you're working your reps up over time.
Yeah, and then for the chin-ups specifically, the way we program it, since it's done twice a week, this approach works very well. If you're trying to do this with other bodyweight movements, but it doesn't get that frequency, it's going to be a slower process. Because like say it's dips and you're only doing dips once a week, it might you mightn't just have as smooth a process, but since the chin's done twice a week, it works really well.
Yeah, and then so since they provided that example, we were able to answer it very specifically. But if you just take the start of this question, how should a client adjust loading and exercise selection for kilo programming? If it's too demanding, like, it's interesting to me because I just think that's one of those questions that they don't have a true understanding of kilo programming, because that doesn't really happen when you're programming for a client.
Well,
if you're,
It could.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, because for the long-term periodization database, this is why we built the low-volume protocol.
Okay.
So you can move them on to the low-volume version of that, and then work on the low end of the set ranges for the B and C series. So their session could look like, say at the early stage session, could be 3x10, 2x12, 2x15.
Yeah.
And that could be it. You could add a D series if you want, with more isolation work if they need, but like, there's nothing wrong with meeting people where they're at on a work capacity level.
Yeah. And that's what I'm saying in terms of just knowing how to manipulate it to fit so it's not too demanding.
Because it can be multiple things, right? So it can be the client's work capacity. So because that's one thing that's really important to understand, like the programs that we have online, they're built for the average person. And the average person responds well to moderate volume prescription, which is what all of these programs are based off of. But if you're using the low volume approach, which is what I would recommend you do in the early stages with a client you don't know, because if they're progressing with low volume, why go to medium volume? It's not needed. Okay. But starting at low volume will progressively build their work capacity. Now, the second thing might also be that there's a misinterpretation of that 7RM. Okay, maybe it's just completely misinterpreted. So that could be a thing. But let's say it's spot on. Let's say it's actually like if it was going to do one set, let's say 7RM, then what you can do with these clients, because it does happen, some people just have, poor work capacity. You just start with like a 5% buffer. Okay, so 7 reps should be 80%, but maybe you start week 1 at 75%, and then you step low to 75%, and then you increase 2.5% on week 2, and then week 3 you go for that target. It's fine. So that's why I'm saying I'm a hybrid with the percentage to rep thing. Like, you have the rep prescription, I use the percentage to gauge, but if the percentage is too much for that person, you readjust the percentage.
Okay, moving on to the next question. How would you periodize remedial lifts for the general population?
So for our remedial lifts, if we don't have a very specific thing that we know that needs targeted, we like to use load potential of the exercise to dictate where it goes within the programming. So we'll pick lower load potential exercises for the accumulation phases and higher load potential exercises for the intensification phases. And then we'll go one step deeper than that and make sure the lowest load potential is the first one introduced. And then it'll gradually build throughout the full macro cycle. But then you just have to be somewhat consistent. Like, so if you follow our program design layout, it'll all fall into place for you, but you have to be consistent with what gets trained on what days. So it's not like you can say Monday C series, we're going to do biceps and triceps, and we're going to put in a very low potential exercise. And then the next phase on the Monday on the C series, we're going to do traps and neck and do like a higher low potential. It has to be a consistent of the same muscle groups if you're going to use that approach. If you just want to hit a broader range of exercise, that's fine. Pick the one that you find most beneficial. But if you're going to try and go from the least low potential to the most low potential, it has to have a continuity of the same muscle groups and demands. Like, so even like you don't want to go from a single joint isolation exercise to a multi-joint. So like, say your phase 1 tricep exercise was a French press. you don't want to then go and say, oh, I'm going to do a California press or a close grip bench press in my next C series because it's more load potential. It does, but it's not a multi-joint exercise. So it just, you have to compare apples to apples.
Yeah. The art of program design.
And to add a layer to this, another thing that you can look at as well is range of motion. Mm-hmm. So, for example, a shorter range of motion exercise creates less damage, less fatigue. So you could use that movement in a accumulation phase where you have more volume of work. So if you're using a exercise that creates less fatigue when you're generating more volume, you're mitigating recovery. So let's say a side step up, for example, could be a good accumulation 1 movement because the range of motion is really short. Whereas, let's say intensification 1, you have a triple jumper step up. This is way more damaging on the recovery perspective because now you have an extremely long range of motion. So it affects recovery. So because of that, you're using it in an intensification phase when there's less overall volume. So that's another aspect to the puzzle.
And then if you're working on shoulder remedials or even biceps or triceps, you want to make sure that you hit all the angles throughout your 4 phases of the macro. So you have to look at that, the big picture too.
Big picture. Okay. Next question. When would you program the Deadstop method with an athlete?
Okay, so the Deadstop method, for those who don't know, there's 2 versions of it. First of all, Deadstop, what it means is the barbell is resting on the side pins of a power rack, immobile. And then from that position, you explode up concentrically, come back down to the pins, and you rest the barbell on the pins for 4 seconds to dissipate elastic energy so that each concentric rep is a true expression of concentric strength. And on top of it, if you want to make it even more sport specific, let's say you're squatting from a Deadstop, you could even relax and let go a little bit off of the barbell for that 4-second count to teach the athlete to go from 0 to 100 real quick, which we see in sport. Just think of a lineman just standing, and then from a standing position, all of a sudden, boom, he needs to explode into the defensive end. So you're trying to mimic that with the Deadstop. Now, there's 2 versions. There's a heavy Deadstop, which would be a maximal strength training method. So you're using in strength phases, and you're using it with as heavy weight as possible. You try to accelerate it as fast as possible, but even if it's a slow concentric, it's fine because we are creating tension concentrically to build more strength at high loads. Then there's a starting strength version where now it's extremely lightweight. And potentially you might want to add bands to facilitate the process to the barbell. But then you go from that Deadstop, and now you explode as fast as you can to try to generate as much speed in the early stages of your concentric phase. And you do so by trying to tap in the widest possible range of motor units as you can very, 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 very early, so you can potentiate acceleration for the rest of the rep. But the weight needs to be really, really light because all of that motor unit activation needs to happen so quickly that if you have high weights, then you're slowing down that process. So starting strength is a very tricky one to train. It's also one that's a little harder to do with short range of motion exercises because you need a little bit of range in order to generate that type of acceleration. Yeah. So where they would go in training, well, the starting strength version would definitely go in the SPP, very close to the competitive period, whereas the Deadstop for max strength would most likely be in the later stage of your general preparation phase when you're just simply trying to create a stronger athlete so that you have more strength to potentiate power in the SPP.
And then this individual also asked, what rep scheme would you use with Deadstop?
Like maximum 4 reps because it's a 4-second pause. And so you don't want the time at retention to be super long. So depending on if you're using it in accumulation or intensification, typically you would use this in intensification and pin touch versions in accumulation, but we're talking anywhere from like 2 to 4 reps.
Yeah. And if you're doing it for starting strength, you can just let your velocity dictate the drop off once you fall out of the zone.
Yes.
So the next question is going to be, what's the velocity? Should it be
1.3 to 1.5 meters per second of mean velocity
for a squat?
Yeah, for a squat.
Yeah. Because it's all over the place.
Yeah. For a squat, like, but the starting strength could be as low as 1 rep, as high as 5. Most people will be around 3.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Okay, switching up the topics a little bit, moving on to one we haven't yet discussed in depth that much on our episodes. We do have our opinions and our beliefs on it, so this will be the first time. But what we believe to be our priorities for nutrition and supplementation. Alex, I'm going to turn this one over to you.
I mean, nutrition is really so interesting because it could be as complicated as you make it or as simple. So I think just like the simple points is definitely, make sure you get enough water. So you're getting half your body weight in ounces per pound. Protein's like the big thing for most people. They're just not getting enough protein. Women tend to not want to eat like a lot of protein. So 1 gram per pound seems to be like the place where most people agree is the minimum that you need. Even for lighter women, there's a minimum threshold. So like 120 grams per pound has been shown that that's the ideal amount of protein. So if you weigh 100 pounds, you should still be getting like 120 grams. Vegetables. People don't want to eat their vegetables, but that's where you get a lot of your micronutrients. You get a lot of your fiber. So if you can aim for 5 to 6 cups of vegetables minimum per day, will get you to your the minimum 25 to 30 grams of fiber. And then, your carbs and your fat will be dictated by your unique metabolism and your goals, but your energy sources, come from the carbs and the fat. So depending on the person, what you're training, if you're in a hypertrophy phase versus a fat loss phase, intensification, accumulation.
Where you currently are.
And where you currently are. And then some people, do you do better, with fats or do you do better with carbs? It's just, it's something you have to play with. But we're also meant to change the way we eat. So if you want to be, to be metabolically flexible, you should be able to eat high fat for a few weeks and then your body adapts and then you might, for another month or so, then you do high carb. It's good to switch it up. Just like in training, we periodize our training, then we should aim to periodize our nutrition.
Yeah, and I think the whole being metabolically flexible is a really cool component, but it also it takes work to get to a point where you can do that. For a while, you do need to figure out what's going to work for you and you need to stick with it. And personally, I do believe that if you're really trying to, on a belief on nutrition, if you're really truly trying to make a change, you do need to track. You need to track in order to know what's working and not working. It's the same thing with training. We track what we do to see our results, to figure out what to go to next. Yeah. If you're not tracking, you'd have no idea. And people... Personally, I didn't weigh food for so long. I didn't really think about it. I knew I ate overall healthy, but then it was I really wanted to whip my ass into shape. I was like, okay, I'll start weighing things. And it completely shifted my mindset on food and prepping my meals because you don't realize how much fat sneaks up into recipes. Sure. You want that fucking full cup of rice with your meals. You don't realize how much more you're adding into your meals with that.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah. And then you can be as, depending on your goal, you can be as lax and as precise as possible. So just as an example, Kelsey right now is, just for fun, she's really trying to peak her body fat for the Euro trip.
We're there right now.
But so in her breakfast, she's eating a slice of Ezekiel bread. But what she's noted, because we use a scale and we measure everything in gram because it's super precise, but she realized that there's huge variability in the weight of each slice of bread.
It's 30 grams to 50 grams each slice of turds. They say on the package it's 30 grams, but I'm like, well, I just want to know. And it's the same thing with the avocado, because I put half an avocado on my toast in the morning. Half an avocado can go from 27 grams to 50 grams of avocado.
Yeah, so it's great, right? So like it can actually change your daily caloric intake by 500 calories by just those little minutia. So when if you get to a point where you're trying to hit the single digit, now obviously the precision needs to increase, but that's just for most of our personal training client that we have. That's so like you want them to track at first, at least for a week or two, so they get the realization of holy shit, that's what 130 calories of peanut butter is. You know?
And I think it's also to prevent snacking, like with tracking, because it's the snacking that adds up.
With a few bites.
And
the moms always get that. They're like, they finish their kid's plate and they're like, oh, I just ate that. But I'm like, yeah, but you ate half
another meal
of your kid's meal. Like, that makes a difference.
And then one thing that I think is a good idea, because I do firmly believe that each individual responds differently to the energy nutrients, like the carbs and the fat, right? So it's a very individual thing, but it's also a reflection of where you are in your training as well. But to me, one tip I would give you guys is, if you have a new client and you don't know where to start, just start isocaloric. Start your energy macro, start 50% of these calories in fats, 50% of these calories in carbs. So at least, you have the best of both worlds, and then you can readjust one up, one down. But that's a tip we've learned a long time ago, and it works well. I mean,
and just to add to that is, like, so you have your caloric goal, you need to set your protein first, and then whatever's left over, then you split between your carbs and your fat, and then you play with those. But if you're low calorie, you still have that protein requirement. So if you go from 2,000 calories to 1,200 calories, you still need to eat the 120 grams of protein. So a lot of people just they'll decrease their protein according to their calories, but the protein goal is really important with that one.
And then Alex, so what's your take on this? So would you agree that, it's pretty well accepted that 1 gram per pound for hard training people is a good starting point for the majority of people. But do you think that as somebody is getting a little bit more extreme with their dieting, so their calories are getting lower and lower, that the protein target should up a little bit?
Yes, for sure. You can increase your protein if you're trying to limit, the metabolic effects of having the extra carbs or the fat and stuff. You can definitely increase your protein. But then it's important, too, to also make sure that you still have room for some healthy fats, some carbohydrates. So, it's just so, nutrition has to be so individualized that it's hard to...
For sure.
And then also I've noticed in the last 10 years, there's a few studies that came out on older people.
Needing more protein.
Like you and I.
Hey.
we might actually need more protein, and especially as we're training hard and oxidizing even more amino acids, that we might need a little bit more. We're not talking about crazy 2 grams per pound or
1.5 maybe. In I think this study I was reading recently, 30. So the recommendation is 30 to 60 grams of protein per meal. So you want to get the 30 grams minimum, so you can get enough leucine, so you get that muscle protein. What's the word I'm looking for?
Synthesis.
Okay. But an older person might need 60 grams of protein to be able to get that.
Yeah, whereas a 14-year-old kid, they say that 14 gram,
so we become less efficient with our protein as we get older, so we actually need more protein, which is the contrary to most people. If you look at old people, they want to eat soup and toast all day, but
and then protein timing becomes way more important the older you get.
Yep.
So the post-workout window really becomes a thing.
Yep.
Whereas for kids, it doesn't really matter. As long as they're hitting their daily goal.
Total protein.
And I think in terms of going back to like my Euro shred, and when you're like, I'm trying to get lean and I'm already at a lean point, using lean protein sources makes a huge difference.
Yeah. Well, because you're so restricted in your calories.
Yeah, but so I still can eat more, and still hit that protein target, but I'm not.
You can add like a bunch of vegetables, so to have like fillers, you know.
So for people who like eating ribeye.
Quiet shots fired.
I did like how Steph described Kelsey's goals as peaking her body fat, because to me that means I'm trying to get the highest body fat possible.
Very true.
Okay, well,
but I just want to add like one thing that I also think is kind of cool. Like it's we learned this from Dr. Donald Lehman. Like he has to be one of the top protein experts, right?
Yeah.
And one thing that I think is very interesting that a lot of people miss the boat on is the minimum leucine threshold to create anabolism, but for breakfast.
Mm-hmm.
So many people, like when like Donald Lehman's is like, I don't know, he must be like in his mid 60s or early 70s.
He has to be at this stage.
Like his breakfast every day is yogurt and whey protein. And why he has whey protein is because a scoop of whey protein has 2.5 grams of leucine, which tends to be the minimum threshold for most humans to create that anabolic cascade. So you want for that first meal of the day to break that fast, to have enough leucine to generate anabolism. So if you're eating, for example, like the beef protein, let's say you're eating beef protein as a supplement, well, it's mostly like collagen driven, so there's not a lot of leucine. So you might have a decent amount of protein per se, but you're about 1/5 from your leucine threshold. So you do not have that same protein synthesis anabolic response from that breakfast.
So basically you're staying catabolic until you hit that first 30 grams of protein. So think about that. Like a lot of people have, the average person has, piece of toast, cereal, a glass of milk. So they don't hit their protein 30 grams until dinner.
Yeah, so that's why a solid animal protein source for breakfast is such a good, easy thing because, like 30 grams of beef, for example, you have that leucine threshold.
Yeah.
And then for all the vegetarian people, they need, and people always want to ask a vegetarian, you're like, oh, well, how do you get your protein? And then they like to say, what do you care about my protein? But it's even more important because the quality of the protein that they're getting is so low that they need even more protein. So they need 1.5 to 2 grams of protein per pound. That's a lot of food. It's a lot of food for a vegetarian.
It's a lot of shakes. Let's be real.
Yeah, unless they use like fortified supplement powders. That
was a good one.
This is going to be abrupt because it was an oversight on my part. Our memory card is running on. So thought that was going to be a rapid fire. I think we covered about 4 questions, but our next episode we'll cover the remainder of the questions. I just want to bring back one final thought to tie this all back in together. Context is everything. So in regards to talking on nutrition and to regards to talking training on fit and your training clients in season, context is everything. And like Steph said earlier in the episode, strength training is more than just hypertrophy. See you next time, fam.
G-Unit.